my life, I have loved documentaries. I remember as a kid when I would sit enthralled in front of the TV and listen to David Attenborough describe nature, from the intricacies of the spider's web to the majesty of the Earth's greatest peaks. That love for documentaries fostered another passion for history, as I would come to learn about the great battles of Rome and Carthage, the conquests of Genghis Khan, and the horrors of the Black Plague. But after I started to struggle with my own personal demons, I also developed a keen interest in psychology, and in particular, the psychology behind some of the world's oldest stories. So imagine my surprise and excitement when I enrolled in my last semester of uni and saw a subject that fit all those boxes perfectly: Afterlife and Underworld in Antiquity. This video is a little different to others that I have previously produced. Rather than delving into a specific topic, this will instead cover a few snapshots from the vast array of Afterlife and Underworld representations throughout history. It serves as an academic journal for the course, so while I'll try to make this as interesting as possible for the outside viewer, I'm not going to pretend that this isn't an assignment that I'm doing for one of my university courses. So, without further ado, let's get into it. We begin our journey among Giza's shifting desert sands, where a collection of Masonic monuments glorify some of history's most revered rulers, the pyramids of ancient Egypt. For 3,500 years, no other man-made structure eclipsed the size of those stone giants, and for the better part of 5 millennia, they have valiantly rebuked the test of time, standing tall in service to their great pharaohs. Such massive constructions can hardly be undertaken without a certain level of reverence for their purpose. In Egypt's case, the pyramids serve as a grave to their rulers, their imposing visage hiding a wealth of treasures from personal effects and food to servants buried alive in service to the pharaoh's next life. This course doesn't pull any punches when it comes to the gruesome details of life in antiquity. The concept of servitude itself is taboo in our culture, let alone being sealed up forever in a man-made mountain as a result of that servitude. The Egyptian reverence for death is irrefutably tied to their reverence for the divine. As in some of the other cultures we'll get to soon, respect for divinity was a big deal in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs themselves were considered to be a bridge between the worlds of the living and the divine. This was one of the points that I had a bit of discussion on outside of class, as it seemed there were some similarities between the role of the ancient pharaoh and the modern pope. Granted, most of our discussion was purely speculative, but it was interesting nonetheless to notice there are certain motifs within religious structures that date all the way back to the beginning of recorded history. Once it's accepted that your king is a living embodiment of the divine, it becomes easier to understand how such massive constructions were justified. To the ancient Egyptians, it wasn't just a tomb for their king. It was a pathway to assist the living embodiment of one of their gods transcend to a higher purpose. As we moved on to Mesopotamia, we saw the same motif reflected once again. Here, the king would periodically be judged for how well he was able to stand as a reflection of the divine spirit. With the king once again serving as a confluence for religious ceremonies and judicator of the law, a pattern started to develop as the ruling class began to inhabit a state of fixed authority, granted to them by an exalted power. After moving away from the cradle of civilization, our class entered perhaps one of my favourite sections of the course, as we dove into Greek mythology. As we explored the stories of Odysseus, Hercules, and Achilles, it would appear that, just like the latter, the modern archetype of the hero seems to have been pulled by the heel out of the tales of ancient Greece. These heroes of antiquity certainly retain much of their former glory, as they find reincarnation within modern retellings of the classic stories. In the class, we discussed some of the classical components that started to make their way into the mythos of an underworld descent, and the character of the individuals that would undertake such tasks. The old adage of there being nothing new under the sun certainly reared its head as we discussed the similarities between films like Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, The Matrix, and Harry Potter, with the stories of Hercules' clash with the Nemean lion and Orpheus' grief for his lost lover. Common tropes such as the gatekeeper offering passage for a price and guardians protecting the gates to the underworld abound in modern cinema. But Orpheus' case was of particular interest to me. Other courses that I have taken taught me to respect the intricacies of ancient stories, as they have often been stripped down over time so that only their most profound and timeless wisdom remains. In Orpheus' case, I wonder why he was directed not to look back at Eurydice as they exited the underworld. Perhaps it could be that a true hero keeps their focus on the task at hand and what lies in front of them, rather than worry about the past and what they leave behind. This is where we as an entire society embarked on our own journey to the unknown, as COVID-19 decided to crawl its way out of the shadows and into the limelight of international news. Unfortunately, much of the previous level of discussion I had been able to engage in with other students met an untimely end at this point in the semester. Still, it was a relief to know that this subject, at least, had its act together quickly and made it possible for us to resume our course without too much difficulty. So kudos to the team for being the very real heroes we all needed there. Unfortunately, unlike the course, I was much slower to get myself organised, as I had to move house and set up in a caravan for much of the remaining semester. During this time, I was relegated primarily to the readings and lectures, as it was almost impossible for me to sustain a connection to the Zoom meetings. I had my 25th birthday, got a very nifty cake, and even rode a motorbike for the first time before I promptly lost control and multed my leg. So, that was fun. While the course itself started to explore the wisdom of Greek philosophers like Plato and Epicurus, I was struck by the stance that Socrates had towards his own death and went down my own little rabbit hole of investigation to tease out the rationale of acceptance behind his now legendary execution. What intrigued me most was Socrates' belief in a personal guiding demon, a spirit of some kind that served a similar role to what I presume we would now consider a conscience. This coupled with some information that I was exploring in my heresy and witchcraft course, where the heretic Peter Abelard spoke on the concept of divine illumination, a philosophy that stated human thought must be aided by a spark of the divine. Abelard's theory insisted on the possibility that early explorers of true morality would have in fact been led to such conclusions by the Spirit of God. I'm still unsure exactly what I think about the whole concept, but seeing my two subjects interlink in such a way proved very exciting. Now, if I'm honest, I have to confess that week 7 lost me for a bit. While I did find Aristophanes' play The Frogs of interest by its exposure of ancient meta-commentary, I think the exact nature of the play proved to be a double-edged sword for those not well-versed in Greek comedy. That is to say, stories that are renowned for their deconstruction or parodies of established tropes and themes within a particular genre don't make a very good entry point into that genre. If I was to provide a contemporary example, the film Monty Python and the Holy Grail would not be nearly as interesting or comical to someone who had never seen a fairy tale film, as moments like this just a flesh wound miss their mark if a viewer isn't even aware the moment is a subversion or critique of the genre. While I wasn't sure what I would have recommended at the time, as I look back on the course as a whole, I think it would have been a better exploration of underworld themes by exploring the psychological depth of Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex. Especially after our exploration of the many faces that heroes wear in different cultures throughout the course, it would have been interesting to critique that schema by exploring the story of the failed hero Oedipus. As it was, Dionysus' descent into the underworld certainly provided moments of hilarity, especially through the depiction of a god, let alone one that should be familiar with the workings of the underworld, being so inept at its navigation. One thing that did catch my eye was the position of the slave Xanthias within the story. Slavery in the modern mind seems almost synonymous with the depictions of Africans forced onto American cotton farms. Without wanting to really open that can of worms, it's hard to gather a proper perspective on the intricacies of Xanthias' character when the concept of these ancient slaves was so unclear, to me at least. As a result, the true extent of Dionysus' voyeuristic humiliation through his envy of Xanthias is hard to grasp. When tackling such a play without considerable background knowledge on the socio-political norms of Aristophanes' audience, it's hard to fully grasp the significance of the play. Moving on to the Roman Empire, and in particular gladiatorial bouts, I found myself retreading familiar ground, as it's been an area that I have studied a few times throughout my student career. So, rather than delving into that, I instead grew quite interested in Virgil's writings on Elysium. Throughout the whole course, I've constantly been amazed at how many ancient concepts of life after death have survived. Elysium seemed like the original birthplace of the classical heaven, or the good place. As a note for the course coordinators, one of the readings for this was really hard for me to get a hold of. The online resource kind of split the book up into a load of component chunks. I struggled for a bit to view it before I admittedly gave up and went on to other readings. Ken Granston's account of Virgil's writing proved much easier to navigate, and in the scholar's writings, he describes some of the differences between Virgil and Homer's representation of that heavenly abode. Of particular note to me was that Homer's account states that Elysium was a physical place that could actually be travelled to, whereas Virgil's required a trip into the Underworld first, before being faced with the choice to travel left into Tartarus or right into Elysium. Virgil's accounts also harken back to the underworld representations of Egypt's Anubis, whose role of judicator of the dead is undertaken by Rhadamanthus, judge of the undead, who reproved the souls of sinners, forcing them to confess crimes committed on earth. Granston's writings go on to further state that Virgil's depiction of Elysium, in particular the wide fields of the air, suggests that Virgil's version transcended the localized tradition of the Isles of the Blessed and have attained a kind of Platonic, even near-Christian paradise. This early representation of the near-Christian paradise stuck with me, as in the next few weeks we started to reconnoitre the Romans' reactions to death, and in particular, their views on the early days of Christian martyrdom. This was the topic that I chose to focus on primarily, and write my eventual study paper on. As I've said, before I had even begun the course, I was curious about how ancient stories have evolved over time, and have come to eventually guide our own culture. The life and death of those early Christian martyrs enthralled me, as I explored the legends of Potamania and Basilides, as well as other early Christians who all but begged to meet their Maker, and secure their own path into the Christian Elysium of heaven. As I researched some of the deeds of those martyrs, I read a passage within John Davis's book, Death, Burial, and Rebirth in Religions of Antiquity, that provided the connection I had been so keen to discover. Davis stated that the martyrological foundation of early Christianity, in all the complexity of its textual and experimental origins, provided the moral template for the self-denying lives of the nun in her celibacy, of the mother in her selflessness, of the worker in his faithfulness, of the scholar in his dedication, of the wife and husband in their chastity, of the pilgrim in his fortitude, of the child in its obedience, and of the soldier in his self-sacrifice. In our first day of class, my tutor wrote something on the board that read, "A society's attitude to death is one of the factors which enables us to both define its culture and empathize with its people as individuals." In this video, I have only been able to scratch the surface of that maxim. The complexities of the ancient world and its legacy can only find so much coverage when reduced to a short YouTube video. I pray that the limited time I have been given to explore our ancestors' attitudes towards the eternal question of what awaits us past the veil of life's journey has at least been enough to pique your interest in the lessons we can learn from the past. So, as we reach the end of our time together, I encourage you to investigate the wealth of knowledge out there. We live in a time where the boundaries between our lives and that of those around us have never been so close. Listen to podcasts. Read books, have discussions, and above all, never lose your thirst for the unknown and the wisdom that it can teach you. I hope this video, like the course I took, can inspire you to explore the wealth of culture that is out there. Until then, thanks for watching.